Okay, so welcome back to the deep dive. We've got a really fascinating one today. This one I'm actually really excited about. Listeners have been sending us stuff. And this one is really right up our alley.
Yeah.
It's Whitney Webb's One Nation Under Blackmail, and specifically Volume 2 of that book, which I know you dug into as well, right?
Yeah, I took a look at it.
We're going to try to dissect some of the most, I think, compelling and maybe less discussed connections that she makes in this book. And particularly, I think, with Jeffrey Epstein and intelligence agencies and the dynamics of power, which I think is something that our listeners are really interested in, kind of understanding what's going on beneath the surface. We're not really going to get into all the details of all of her sourcing and everything, but I think we can pull out some of the main points here that she makes in this book, and I think it'll be really illuminating for our listeners. So one of the things I think is interesting is she talks about this connection to Epstein and intelligence, which I think is something that's sort of been alluded to out there, but never really deeply investigated.
Yeah, I mean, it's worth stating right from the start that everything we're going to talk about today is really based on the content of the book. It is very well sourced. She's clearly done her research, drawn on a lot of reporting, cited sources. But, we're going to be talking about some complex relationships and some serious allegations. And so, it's worth stating right from the start that we're really focusing on what the book presents. One of the interesting things that the book brings up is this idea that Epstein may have had affiliations with, the CIA, Israeli intelligence, maybe both. And this is something that has been reported by, various outlets, various sources, but kind of the mainstream media generally hasn't really wanted to dive deep into these connections.
Right. It's kind of focused more on the sex trafficking side of it.
Yeah. Which, obviously those are horrific crimes. But, it does kind of raise an interesting point, I think, that the book brings up, which is that the idea that he was just this sort of lone wolf mastermind of, this massive sex trafficking operation, that might obscure the role of, intelligence links.
It kind of begs the question, like, if that is true, what else was going on?
Right. I mean, it kind of ties into this bigger theme I think that the book is getting at, which is that there's kind of a reluctance to look at areas that might implicate, larger entities, more powerful people.
Yeah.
And so it really does make you think about, who benefits from certain narratives kind of taking precedence.
Totally. So one of the things that I think is also interesting is the amount of time that Epstein spent in the Clinton White House between 1993 and 1995. 17 known meetings.
Yeah, that's a lot.
That's a lot of meetings at the White House.
Yeah, that's a lot of access.
And the book notes that he often brought young women with him to these meetings. And then another thing that I thought was really fascinating, she points to this guy, Mark Middleton, who, died under mysterious circumstances in May of 2022. And she talks about how, at that time, Middleton was actually involved in some foreign espionage activities, which Congress ended up investigating, related to illegal fundraising efforts for Bill Clinton's reelection campaign in '96.
Right. So, connecting that to the larger picture, the book is kind of making this argument that Epstein's activities in the Clinton White House during this period may point to a scandal, basically, a scandal from that era that has remained largely uninvestigated. The fact that he was making so many visits and that, you have Middleton who's involved in all this.
Allegedly.
Yeah, allegedly. And, the fact that he's bringing young women with him, it does raise some red flags. I mean, it makes you wonder, like, how much scrutiny was actually being applied to visitors to the White House? Or maybe what were the specific reasons why he was being granted so much access?
Yeah, totally. She also notes that one of Epstein's early visits to the White House in February of '93 was signed off by Robert Rubin, who later became Treasury Secretary.
Right.
And, she ties in the fact that Robert Rubin also was connected to Robert Maxwell and his financial dealings.
Yeah.
So it's like she's kind of connecting all these threads, for you listening out there.
Yeah. And again, it's kind of like looking at the significance of these seemingly disparate connections. But, when you look at it through the lens that the book is providing, it's like, okay, Rubin is involved in both Maxwell's financial world and he's involved in Epstein's access to the White House. So again, it adds kind of another layer to this picture the book is trying to paint of these interconnected power structures.
Right. And then kind of switching gears a little bit, she talks about how blackmail has evolved in this digital age. And, she argues that traditional sex blackmailers, quote, are now expendable.
Right. That's a really crucial point, I think, that the book makes. Because, the argument there is that basically, we have the capacity now to gather and analyze so much data through all of this technology, and that creates new avenues for influence and coercion. And so, in a sense, people like Epstein, who might have relied on more traditional methods of blackmail, they may be becoming less indispensable, to those who are seeking to wield power.
Yeah, it's not just about having compromising photos anymore.
Right. Right. I mean, think about it, the ability to sort of analyze huge data sets and reveal, vulnerabilities, associations, behaviors, all this kind of stuff. That can be used for coercion in a way that, maybe traditional methods couldn't.
Right. And she argues that this may explain Epstein's efforts to get close to and even blackmail, prominent people in Silicon Valley after his first arrest, in the mid-2000s for sex trafficking. And she's kind of tying that in to this evolution of blackmail.
Yeah. If you're connecting it to the bigger picture, it's like, okay, he's kind of moving away from these traditional methods. And he's investing in data harvesting firms. He's involved with, people who are doing mass surveillance. So it's like, he's not just this relic of an older era of blackmail. It's like he's actually trying to, adapt and leverage these new realities for his own purposes.
Right, right. And then she goes into his early career kind of talking about some of the influences and, who may have shaped his trajectory. And one of the things she talks about is his hiring at Dalton School, which was kind of unconventional.
Yeah. So the interesting thing here is that, he was hired by Donald Barr. Donald Barr was the headmaster at the time. And, Epstein didn't really have the typical academic qualifications that you'd expect from a teacher at Dalton. And so, the book points out that, Barr had a reputation for hiring what he called unconventional teachers. But the thing that I think is really interesting here is that Donald Barr's son, William Barr, later went on to work for the CIA. So, you kind of have this overlap, and it does make you wonder about these early connections, to the intelligence world, potentially.
Totally. And then she goes into his, entrance to Wall Street, which was at Bear Stearns in 1976. And she had a couple different accounts, actually, of how he ended up getting that job. But both involved this guy, Alan Greenberg, who later went on to become the CEO of Bear Stearns.
Right.
And so, she talks about one account was that there was this Wall Street father who was really impressed with Epstein while he was teaching at Dalton, or tutoring at Dalton, actually. Or another account was that maybe he knew Greenberg's daughter or had tutored Greenberg's son. But regardless, Greenberg was the guy who brought him in.
Right. The thing that's worth noting here is that, regardless of which account is true, the book makes it clear that Greenberg was really the key figure who brought Epstein into Bear Stearns. And so, that marked a really significant turning point in his career.
Yeah. And then she goes on to talk about the merger of Empire Trust Company, which Edgar Bronfman Sr. was involved with the Bank of New York in 1968.
Right.
And she's kind of weaving these threads together.
Yeah. She notes that Bronfman actually joined the board of Bowen Y after this merger. And the thing that I think is really interesting, again, connecting back to sort of these financial networks we were talking about, is that by the 1980s, Bowen Y had essentially merged with the banking network of Bruce Rappaport. And by 1992, executives at the bank were found to be really closely associated with Semyon Mogilevich. And Mogilevich, if you recall, was actually a business associate of Robert Maxwell.
Oh, wow.
So again, you have all of these kind of financial networks and connections.
Right. And then speaking of Maxwell, she brings up this pretty explosive allegation that Stephen Hoffenberg, who was Epstein's associate, made, which is that in the early 80s, Epstein was trained in arms trafficking and money laundering.
Wow.
By Adnan Khashoggi and Sir Douglas Leese.
Right.
Allegedly, for Israeli interests and UK activities.
Yeah.
So this is kind of a bombshell allegation.
Yeah. It is. And, the book goes into some detail about both Khashoggi and Leese. Khashoggi, of course, was this infamous arms dealer. And, Lisa's son, Julian, he actually denies that his father was an arms dealer. And he says that, he worked in defense products, like radar systems. But he does admit that his father was, a friend of Khashoggi. Okay. And the book actually, it mentions that Leese did have documented connections to this Chinese arms manufacturer, Norinco.
Right.
And that Khashoggi was a client of Epstein during this period.
Oh, wow.
So again, it does make you kind of think about what kind of, training and connections he might have been acquiring during this time.
Yeah. And she even points out that Khashoggi's yacht was sold to Donald Trump
Right.
with the involvement of the Sultan of Brunei,
Right.
who later goes on to become Epstein's landlord. So, all of these seemingly, disparate characters.
Yeah. It's really fascinating how she kind of ties all these people together. Again, it just suggests that there's a lot more going on here, than what's typically presented. I mean, there's a level of, international intrigue here.
Totally. She talks about this New York State Select Committee on Crime Investigation in 1982. And this was interesting because they found that an accountant for several call service operations in Washington, D.C. was selling information on clients' sexual proclivities to foreign intelligence services.
Yeah. That's a pretty disturbing detail.
Yeah.
It kind of provides this historical context, I think, for the potential use of sexual information as a tool for intelligence gathering, which I think ties in with kind of this bigger theme that the book is exploring, the whole intersection of sex and power and intelligence. The book notes that this wasn't just an isolated incident.
Right.
Because another call service operator also reported selling information specifically to British and Israeli intelligence.
Right. And then she talks about this alleged Saudi passport that was linked to Epstein. And this was in 1982. And it was this purported Austrian passport under an unknown alias. And it had a Saudi Arabian address, and it had stamps from France, Spain, the UK, and Saudi Arabia. So, this really does point to this idea that he was operating, internationally. And, maybe had some pretty significant connections.
Yeah. What's fascinating about that is that, again, it ties in a lot of these key figures. Saudi Arabia, obviously, connects to Khashoggi.
Right.
Potentially to Saudi intelligence, UK, France, connecting back to the Maxwell family. And then Spain, it's possible that visit could be related to this, reported role he had in helping to recover money for Spaniards after the Drysdale government securities collapse.
Oh, wow.
So again, it's like another piece of this really, really intricate puzzle that the book is trying to put together.
Yeah. She talks about Ron Lauder's connection to U.S. intelligence and his close ties to the Israeli government.
Yeah.
And, she points out that he co-founded CETV with Mark Palmer. And Palmer also co-founded the National Endowment for Democracy, the NED, which some have said has connections to the CIA.
Right.
And, she quotes the first president of the NED saying that, quote, "A lot of what we do today was done covertly 25 years ago by the CIA."
Right. So, it does make you wonder about Lauder's connections to intelligence and, how those might intersect with his relationships with people like Epstein.
Right. And then she introduces this guy, Max Fisher, who she calls a powerful Detroit industrialist.
Right.
And he was very close with Israel.
Right.
And he was at the center of this kind of old boys network that included, Leslie Wexner and Henry Ford II.
Right. So she describes Fisher as this really important figure in mobilizing support for Israel during the 1967 and 1973 wars. But, more importantly for our discussion is that she points to his role as kind of the nexus of this, network of really wealthy and well-connected business associates, including Wexner. And, they partnered in various business ventures. They were involved in, the acquisition of Sotheby's, the auction house. So, he seems to have been this kind of key figure who was connecting, different centers of power.
Right. And then she gets into this whole thing with Leslie Wexner and the potential connections to organized crime. Yeah. And she brings up the Shapiro murder file, which investigated the 1990 murder of Arthur Shapiro. Yeah. And, the motive for that was allegedly related to an IRS investigation where Shapiro was actually going to testify. And the file names Leslie Wexner and Edward DeBartolo Sr. And DeBartolo had appeared on this Justice Department list of individuals with suspected links to organized crime.
Yeah. And an FBI wiretap even captured claims that DeBartolo was very friendly with a mob boss from Youngstown, Ohio, his hometown. Yep. So, the book really emphasizes this close association between Wexner and DeBartolo, in the context of these potential organized crime ties. And so, again, it's like you're seeing these really complex relationships that are developing at, the highest levels of business and influence.
Right. And then, of course, there's this big question about Wexner's relationship with Jeffrey Epstein.
Right.
And, it's been widely reported that Wexner's associates were kind of mystified by his trust in Epstein.
Yeah. Because, he really didn't have much of a resume. And he didn't have much financial experience, before Wexner really brought him in and gave him this huge opportunity.
Right. And so she's kind of positing that maybe it was Epstein's connection to, these intelligence-linked arms dealers
Right.
and these financial, talents, quote unquote, that he claimed to have,
Right.
that may have been really attractive to Wexner.
Yeah. Especially in the period following Shapiro's murder.
Right.
There's this interesting quote in the book where Epstein says, "Les knows everything about me. He knows every experience I've had." So that implies, a much deeper level of, understanding and maybe shared history
Right.
than what's publicly acknowledged.
Yeah.
It really makes you think about, what was Epstein's real value proposition to somebody like Wexner?
Yeah. Yeah. And then she talks about the Wexner Foundation.
Right.
And, the co-founder of that was Rabbi Herbert Friedman,
Right.
who had a long career of supporting Israel. And it also involved figures like Stanley Hiller, who said that it was, quote, unusual with its own agenda and programming.
Right. Okay.
And then Charles Liebman, who was this influential Jewish political scientist with a Zionist background. He was on the original advisory board.
Right.
She talks about this program called the Wexner Heritage Program,
Right.
which was aimed at enhancing leadership in the North American Jewish community.
Mm.
And then she talks about this connection between Harvard president Larry Summers
Right.
and Ezra Rosofsky, who chaired the Wexner Fellowship Committee.
Right.
So, again, tying these institutions together.
Right. Right. It's
Yeah.
all kind of connecting Wexner's philanthropic efforts with, these really powerful institutions.
Yeah, yeah. And then, that kind of leads into her discussion of Epstein's connections to Harvard.
Mm-hmm.
And she points out that Wexner actually significantly increased his donations to Harvard
Right.
during the same period that Epstein was developing his relationships there.
Right.
And she specifically mentions this program called the Wexner Israel Fellowship Program
Right.
at the Harvard Kennedy School,
Right.
which supported Israeli public officials.
Right.
And then she mentions David Gergen talking about, Wexner's dedication to public life.
Right.
And this was, in the context of him giving a lot of money to Harvard Center for Public Leadership. So again, you see these connections.
Right. It kind of makes you wonder, about the potential influence that those donations and connections might have had.
Yeah, totally. And then she talks about this group called the Mega Group, which included Wexner and Bronfman.
Yeah.
And, it was ostensibly focused on philanthropy.
Right. But the book kind of raises some questions about the group's real intentions.
Yeah.
Because of the members' ties to organized crime and intelligence. And she points to Steven Spielberg in this section.
Okay.
And his connection to Lou Wasserman, who was this Hollywood mogul with ties to the mob.
Yeah.
So she's suggesting that maybe the mega group wasn't just about philanthropy,
Right.
that maybe there were, other things going on.
Yeah. Yeah. And then, this is a pretty bombshell allegation. She even suggests that Epstein may have played a role in securing support for the Iraq War.
Right.
Through the sexual blackmail of U.S. senators.
Yeah.
Potentially even at a Wexner-owned residence. So, that's a pretty big allegation.
Yeah. Yeah. If true, that would have huge implications for our understanding of, major political events.
Totally. Totally. And then she kind of shifts gears and she talks about Ghislaine Maxwell's early life in New York.
Mm.
And she moved there, reportedly, to help expand her father's influence.
Right.
And establish, this Maxwell dynasty.
Right. The book actually describes Ghislaine as her father's, ticket into New York society.
Right.
And it's interesting because the book also mentions that there were even some reports that Robert Maxwell hoped that Ghislaine would marry John F. Kennedy Jr.
Oh, wow.
So, it suggests that he really saw her as being instrumental in his ambitions, for greater power and prestige.
Right, right. And she did become friends with John F. Kennedy Jr.
Yeah.
And there's some reports that they even had, a brief, intimate encounter.
Right.
And at this time, she founded the Kit Kat Club.
Right.
And, the origins of that name are kind of mysterious. Maybe a reference to Cabaret, the musical.
Right. The book explores a bunch of different potential origins for that name.
Yeah.
There was this 18th century London club called the Kit Kat Club.
Right.
And then obviously the famous musical. But the real reason for, why she chose that name for her club remains unclear.
Right. Right. And then she kind of dives back into Robert Maxwell a little bit, and she talks about how he acquired Pergamon Press.
Right.
And that was partly financed by the Rothschilds. And he even made a joint bid for the Jerusalem Post with Charles Bronfman.
Right.
So, again, all these connections.
Right. And what I think is really fascinating in this section is that the book points to Robert Keith Gray, this guy who had extensive ties to U.S. intelligence.
Right.
But he was also connected to all these call girl rings and sexual blackmail rings. And the book suggests that Gray may hold the key to understanding Robert Maxwell's ambitions in New York City and the role that he kind of envisioned for Ghislaine.
Right.
Yeah.
And then she goes back into Epstein's introduction to the Clintons.
Right.
And Hoffenberg actually claimed that in 1987, quote, Donald's crowd was my crowd.
Right.
So that suggests, this early connection there, even though it was maybe indirect.
Right.
She mentions this 1995 letter from Lynn Forrester to Rothschild to President Clinton.
Right.
That mentions Epstein and currency stabilization.
Right.
So that indicates that they knew each other, pretty early on.
Right.
And she even suggests that Epstein played a role in Forrester to Rothschild's divorce in 1993.
Oh, wow.
So, that kind of illustrates his ability to sort of navigate these high-profile personal situations.
Yeah. I mean, he clearly had a knack for, kind of getting involved in those kinds of things.
Yeah. And then she gets into this whole thing with Chinagate.
Right.
And White House access.
Right.
And she talks about all this illegal fundraising that was going on for the Clinton administration.
Right. With foreign money.
Yeah.
A lot of it from Chinese sources.
Right.
The Riady family.
Right.
And the Lippo Group.
Right.
And so she goes into detail about how figures like Charlie Try and Johnny Chung facilitated these donations, sometimes using, straw donors and stuff like that. And they gained access to the White House, high-ranking officials. Mark Middleton's role in lobbying for John Huang's position at the DNC is mentioned here, in this context of foreign influence and White House access.
Yeah. She mentions how Laurel Space and Communications received approvals for satellite exports to China despite security concerns after heavy donations to the DNC.
Right.
And then she even talks about the suspicious death of Ron Brown.
Right.
The Commerce Secretary.
Right.
In a plane crash.
Right.
And she notes some anomalies discovered by investigators.
Yeah. So, again, you kind of see how this is a really, really murky period.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of questions that arose, regarding White House access and security at that time.
Right. And then she goes back to the Epstein White House visits, and she reiterates that the first visit was facilitated by Rubin.
Right.
And later visits were signed off by Ann Stock and Lisa Mortman, who both appear in Epstein's contact book.
Right. So again, it's kind of emphasizing this unusual access that he had to the White House.
Right.
It wasn't just one or two isolated visits. It was
Right.
like this pattern of access that, the book argues warrants further scrutiny.
Right. And then after Bill Clinton left office, his relationship with Epstein seems to have deepened, according to the book. She notes that Clinton spent considerable time with Epstein, focused on launching the Clinton Foundation.
Yeah.
And Epstein was reportedly very involved in, shaping Clinton's, post-presidential philanthropy.
Right.
She talks about how Clinton took several trips on Epstein's plane between 2002 and 2003.
Right.
Often accompanied by Doug Band and Ghislaine Maxwell.
Right.
And these trips were, they went to Asia, they went to Africa.
Right.
They even went on a trip with Kevin Spacey and Chris Tucker to Africa.
Yeah. So those travel logs, as presented in the book, I think, offer a really interesting glimpse into the relationship between Clinton and Epstein, at this time when Clinton is kind of setting up his post-presidency activities.
Right. And she mentions that Ron Burkle and Casey Wasserman, who's the grandson of Lou Wasserman, also joined some of those trips.
Right. So again, you're seeing all of these connections between business, politics, entertainment, all kind of coming together.
Yeah. Yeah, and then she also talks about Epstein's connection to Prince Andrew.
Right.
And she notes that Ghislaine Maxwell was the one who reportedly introduced them.
Right.
And their relationship went on for years.
Right.
And, there's this allegation that Epstein actually bragged about having, compromising information on Prince Andrew.
Right. The book kind of speculates that Maxwell and Epstein may have actually strategically targeted Andrew, because of the protection from prosecution that an association with the British royal family could offer. So, I think it illustrates how powerful connections could be sought, for various reasons.
Yeah. Yeah. And then she talks about, Epstein in the tech world. And she points to this 2001 article in the Evening Standard that actually reported Epstein having business links to Bill Gates.
Right.
And that was, way before the mainstream media, reported that they had met, which wasn't until 2011.
Right. So, that early report, as pointed out by the book, kind of contradicts the later narrative,
Right.
that they only met much later. And the book also mentions Isabel Maxwell, Robert Maxwell's daughter, having business dealings with Microsoft and Bill Gates through this company called ComTouch. And Nathan Myhrvold, who was Microsoft's first CTO and a close advisor to Gates, also had ties to Epstein. So it suggests, that maybe there were more established connections within the tech world there.
Right, right. And it seems like he had a lot of connections in the tech world. He was linked to John Brockman,
Right.
the founder of Edge Foundation,
Right.
and, the billionaires' dinners that he held
Right.
that were attended by, people from all the major tech companies.
Right. So the book kind of emphasizes that, he was really trying to court prominent scientists and tech figures. And, it mentions his interest in things like eugenics.
Yeah, right.
And this reported desire he had to, seed the human race with his DNA. He also had this, controversial relationship with Joe Eco at the MIT Media Lab, which led to scrutiny over donations.
Right.
So, you see how he was involved in all of these different, areas of the scientific community.
Yeah, yeah. And then, one of the last points she makes is this connection between blackmail and technology, specifically mass surveillance technologies. And she talks about the development of MainCore in the 80s, which was reportedly this FEMA database of Americans who were considered threats to national security.
Yeah.
And then programs like Total Information Awareness and Palantir.
Right. So these are really examples of, government and private sector data analysis tools that have, huge implications for privacy and surveillance. She also brings up Christine Maxwell, who's Robert Maxwell's daughter, and her involvement with Promise Software.
Right.
And her company, Chiliad. And, she kind of connects all of that to, the history of compromised software and intelligence gathering. And then she mentions these platforms like Carbine, which is this next generation 911 platform with ties to Israel.
Right.
So, it raises concerns about centralized access to all this data. And, ultimately, the book's argument is that Epstein's interest in big tech, it was really linked to the reshaping of blackmail and influence operations through digital means. It suggests this kind of strategic understanding of how technology could be used for those purposes.
Right, right. So I think, we've covered a lot of ground here today. I mean, it's a dense book.
Yeah, it is.
But, I think we've hit on some of the major points that she makes about, Epstein and his potential ties to intelligence.
Yeah.
And his, access to all these powerful figures.
Yeah, and it's important, I think, to remember the early influences that she talks about. Going back to Dalton School, Wall Street, and then his relationships with people like Max Fisher and Leslie Wexner. All of that paints a much more complex picture, I think.